Zeches Megillah Daf Ches discusses 5 mishnayos. It has no less than 5 very small mishnayos, each one continuing the list of the Ein Bains, which are similar halachos, and the Mishnah is going to identify the difference between the two. The Gemara for each one will either give sources of the halacha or show that there are some other differences between the two and some other analysis. So the first thing on the list, first Mishnah which begins the daf, is the difference between a moder hana and a moder meichel. That's somebody who says, I swear I'm not going to get any hana from someone, and someone who says, I swear I'm not going to get any food from someone. What's the difference between the two? Now you would think that it's obvious what the difference is, but it's not so simple, because someone who says I'm not going to get any food also cannot get any monetary benefit from someone, because anywhere he saves money based on a person, he could use that money to buy food. So that would be called getting food from someone. And if somebody says I'm not going to get hana from someone, there's a machlokas if that includes something which nobody cares about, where you get something from someone that is not something that you're makbid on. You would allow someone to have that activity, to have that right, not caring who the person is. That's not even called a hana according to most opinions. So what then is the difference between the two? What's a hana that's not a meichel? What's a hana that doesn't count as a food? So the Mishnah says there are two things. It's borrowing a kli which is not useful for food, borrowing any kli, which is, again, it's going to have to be a kli that you don't save money by borrowing it, but it also has to be something that's not food related, because if it's food related, that's called getting food benefit from someone, and then it's also for the moder hana as well as for the moder meichel. So, but if you borrow a kli which has no monetary gain, you don't save any money, and it's not food related, that's aser if you're a moder hana, but it's not aser if you're only moder meichel. Another thing is allowing somebody to walk through your property. That's something which is allowed for a moder meichel, but not for a moder hana. So the Gemara asks, walking through your property, you would allow anybody to walk through your property. Why is that considered to be something which is aser for a moder hana? The Gemara answers, this is the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, who holds that even something which you don't care who's the one who does that activity, that's still called a hana, and it's still also for a moder hana. Now we get to the next Mishnah, which is the difference between nidarim and nidavos. That's if somebody promises to bring a carbon. So it depends what language he uses. It may be a neder or maybe a nidava. The Mishnah explains, a neder is something where if you lose it, you are responsible to replace it. A nidava is something where if it gets lost or destroyed, you're not responsible to replace it. You no longer have a chi of carbon on you. Now, the Gemara explains the difference between the two is, what do you say? Do you say, I am going to bring a carbon? If you do, then the responsibility is upon you. Then even if you later designate a specific animal and that animal is lost or stolen or dies or is otherwise destroyed, then you still have the responsibility. That's a neder, because you are responsible to bring the carbon. If, however, you take a certain animal and you say, this is a carbon, then you're not responsible to bring a carbon. You're responsible to bring this thing as a carbon as long as it's eligible. Something happens to it, your responsibility has ended. Says the Gemara, what is the same with these two? The halacha of Baal Ta'acher, which we saw in Masachas Rosh Hashanah, you're not allowed to delay, you have to bring it on time, you have to bring it quickly. That is the same for both of these types of karbanos. Now, the Gemara wants to know, what is the source of the difference between a neder and a nedava? How do you know that if you do a neder and you say Harei Alai carbon, you say that it's on me, that you have to replace if something happens? Maybe you said it's on you, but if something replaces, you don't have to do it. So the Gemara explains, the pasuk says V'nir tzoleh l'chaper olav. You'll only be accepted if you do what was alav, what was on you, what the responsibility which is on you. The fact that it's called on you means it's riding on your shoulders, the Gemara says. So you only will achieve the atonement and achieve the nirtza, achieve the appeasement, if you do what's alav, if you do what's riding upon your shoulders specifically. Okay, now we begin the next mission, which goes into the halachos of a zav who sees 2 or 3 zivos. Let's explain. A zav is a man who has a seminal flow which is not brought about by an arousal. It's just a accident. It's a flow that's just really a leakage. So the halacha is that when he has such a flow, he becomes tamei, and there's a special stringency to his tumah that it's matame mishkav v'moshev. If he sits or lies upon anything, then he's matame that thing that he sits or lies upon, even if he's not touching it. So if he's on 10 layers, the bottom layer is tamei as well as the top layer because he sat on it. That is the special chumrah of tumas zav. Now, a zav who sees twice in 2 days or less, has these halachos. A zav who sees 3 times in 3 days or less, additionally, has the halacha that he has to bring a special carbon for ziva. Now, there is a ziva's halacha for women as well, but that's a different type of ziva, which we'll get to further on in the Gemara. So the Gemara here, the Mishnah says, what is the difference between a zav who sees twice within 2 days or a zav who sees 3 times within 3 days? The difference is that if he sees 3 times within 3 days, he has to bring a carbon. Now, the Gemara points out, as far as the extra halachos of tumah, that it's matame, things which are underneath him that he's sitting or lying upon, even without touching them, that applies to both types of zav, a 2-day or a 2-time, that is, or a 3-time zav. Another halacha that's the same for the both of them is that they have to count 7 clean days before they can go to the mikveh and be tahar. They have to have 7 days with no ziva flows. If they have any ziva flow in the middle, it's knocked out. They have to start over again. Now, the Gemara wants to know what is the source of these halachas. Specifically, how do we know that a 2-time zav and a 3-time zav are the same for tumah, but they're different for karbonos? So the Gemara is going to bring a combination of 2 psukim. Rav Simai says if you look at the psukim, there are 2 separate psukim discussing a zav. One mentions the words of twice, and one mentions it 3 times. Rashi brings the psukim ve'ishki zav mi b'sarai zayvai tamehu. That's twice, and then you have 3 times v'zaystia tumasei b'zayvai ror b'sarai zayvai oy hichtim b'sarai mi zayvai. That's 3 times. So these 2 psukim, one is talking about a zav who sees twice, and one is talking about a zav who sees 3 times. It calls them both tamei, but there's got to be something additional about the one who sees 3 times. Otherwise, why is it mentioned in a separate pasuk? So the Gemara says that's to teach me that extra one, the one who has 3 times, he has to bring a carbon as well. So the Gemara says maybe he only has to bring a carbon. Maybe he's different. Maybe it's different halacha. One pasuk is talking about one who sees twice and he's tamei, and the one who sees 3 times is a different pasuk and he has to bring a carbon, but he's not tamei. The Gemara says that can't be, because if he saw 3 times, he also saw twice. After he saw the second time, he became tamei, and there was nothing to take that tamei off. The Gemara says, well, maybe it's the other way. Maybe they both have to bring a carbon, but only one of them is tamei. Maybe both a 2-time and a 3-time zav have a carbon, but a 2-time zav is not tamei, and a 3-time zav becomes tamei when he sees the 3rd time. The Gemara says that can't be, because we have an additional pasuk which teaches me mizoivai. It says the word mizoivai, which is some of the zavs. Some zavs will have this halacha of a carbon, but not all zavs have to bring a carbon. Therefore, a 2-time zav doesn't bring a carbon, and a 3-time zav does bring a carbon. And the halacha about which they're both the same is the tumah. And where it says, well, maybe it's the other way. Maybe a 2-time zav brings a carbon and not a 3-time zav. The Gemara says that can't be, because what takes off the chi of carbon when he has his 3rd riyah? Now the Gemara says, why do I need both psukim? So the Gemara explains, I need mizayvai to tell me, like the answer to the kasha we asked, that it's only about the karbonos have to be what's split between the 2 types of zavs, and that it's not the tumah that's split between the 2, but everybody brings carbon. And I need the 2 psukim, one which has the word zav mentioned twice, and one which has the word zav mentioned 3 times, to tell me what the numbers are. I may think that it's 1 and 2, or 3 and 4. This pasuk teaches me that it's 2 and 3. There's the Gemara, okay, I'll accept that. You're telling me you could learn from the word mizoivoi that it only applies to some zavs. So where it says, but the word mizoivoi appears in a different pasuk. What are you going to learn from that mizoivoi? What's that pasuk? It's talking about the halacha you have to count 7 clean days before you can go to the mikveh. It says, yitar hazav mizoivoi, and the zav will be clean from his zav, mizoivoi, v'safar loy, shevas yam, he has to count 7 days, l'taras, his cleanliness, and then he can put him and his clothing in the mikvah, and he becomes a tahar. So, what is learned from this mizoivai? What's excluded from this? So Gemara says, this mizoivai teaches me 2 things. First of all, the usage of the word mizoivai, and second of all, the fact that we put mizoivai together with the description of the halachas of counting 7 clean days. So first of all, mizoivai is to teach me that he only has to become tar from his ziva. Let's say he also has taras. Does he have to become tar from ziva and taras before you let him go to the mikveh? No. Mizayvi says he should be only tar from zav. He can go to the mikveh for zav. He'll have certain more lenient halachas. He'll still have tumas taras, but he won't have mishkav u'moishav. Then, when it becomes tamei from his taras, he'll go to the mikvah for that. But he could become tahar from his some zav tuma halachos without having to wait until he gets his taras off. That's why it says mizayvei. Now, mizayvei together with v'safar is to teach you that the halacha of counting, which you have to count 7 clean days, applies not only to a zav who had 3 times, but even to a zav who only has twice. How do you learn that? Mizayvei, from some of his zav, is to say even somebody only had some zavs, somebody only had 2, not the full set of 3, he still has to count 3. Now, the Gemara explains that if I wouldn't have this pasuk, I would think that a zav who only saw twice does not have to count 7 clean days. And even though I would think, hey, why should it be different than a zav who counts 3 days? After all, the other halachas of tumah are the same for 2 or 3 days. But here it's different because there's something you could have learned from a woman, from a zavah, who only saw twice. The halacha of a zava only saw twice, that she doesn't have to count 7 clean days. Even if she saw once or twice, she only has to count 1 clean day for each. She only has to count 1 clean day. If she saw 3 times, she also has to count 7. But so I may learn from the zava, from the female zav to the zav, that she, just like she only has to count 1 clean day, a zav who only saw twice also only has to count 1 clean day. Therefore, I need the pasuk mizayvai to tell me no. Even somebody only has partial ziva still has to count 7 clean days. So where it says this is a little funny here. You use the word mizayvai for 2 different drashas. One, just now you used it as an inclusory word to include even a partial zav. But before, you use it to exclude a partial zav from karbanos. Use it to say that only some zavim have to have karbanos, not others. Only somebody who has the full 3 zivas has to bring a carbon, but not somebody who only had 2. So which is it? Does the word mizayvei include the person who had only 2 zivas, or does it exclude it? You can't use it both ways. So the verse says, yes, I can. It's to tell me the opposite of what I would have thought otherwise. In the case of the karbanos, I would have thought it should be the same. And therefore, it's coming to teach me that it's different. There's a difference between the 2 times zav and the 3 times zav as far as hilchos karbanos. Here, as far as the halacha of counting the clean days, I would have learned from a zava. And therefore, I would have said that you do not have to count clean days if you only saw twice. And the pasuk here has to therefore say, mizayvai, to come teach me even somebody only has a partial ziva, still has to count 7 clean days. Now, you may think that it's used only for tzaras, but like we said earlier, that's not enough of an explanation of why the word mizayvai appears in the pasuk of counting, and therefore I have an extra limud from there. All right, that concludes the Gemara's discussion of zav, and now we have our next Mishnah, which talks about mitzayra. Now, tzaras takes hold of a person in differing stages. When the Kohen first looks at the tzaras, he may lock up the mitzayra for 1 week or for 2 weeks, and that he gets a partial tzaras label at that time. And then he's locked up to see if he gets simane tahara or simane tuma, if the tzaras gets yellow hair, or if it spreads, in which case it becomes tamei for sure, gets a real tzaras, or if it doesn't spread, or if it shrinks, in which case he goes back to being tahar. He can be matahar himself. So when he's in this lockup stage, he has some tuma halachos, and when he's in the fully decided tuma stage, like if he got simane tuma after the lockup, then he has tumah as well. What's the difference between the 2 types of tumas? So the Gemara says the difference is priya and prima. That the rending of the clothing, the disheveled appearance of the clothing and of the hair, that's something that applies only to a mitzayra mukhlat, one who is determined as a tamei, and not a mitzayra musgar, one who is just locked up. Now, as far as the purification process, somebody who is a musgar only has to go to the mikvah. Somebody who is a mukhlat, who became a real tzaras, a finalized tzaras, he has to have all his hair shaved, and also has to bring the entire karbanos procedure, which the Torah describes, involving 2 birds. Okay, says the Gemara, as far as the halacha of shiluach, that a matzah has to be sent out of the camp, that applies evenly to both of them. And now let's ask, where do we know the halacha that there is a difference between a musgar and a mukhlat as far as priya or prima? That is, that they do not have to, a musgar, one who is only locked up, does not have to have the disheveled appearance of the clothing and the hair. So how do you know that does not apply to a musgar? So the Gemara says, from the pasuk describing the purification, the tahara process of the musgar, it says, v'chibes begada v'toher, and he should wash his clothing in the mikvah, and then v'taher, he is a tahar. Now, usually the tahar only takes place when the sun goes down. How could it say v'taher and he's tahar right away? That's not true. It must mean that he's tahar from something because he never had some tahara. The fact that he's no longer that he's able to go to the mikvah avoids his tumah getting stronger and him becoming a mukhlat. There's something that he never had altogether. He's not going to go past the level. That's referring to Priyo Prima. That's referring to that disheveled appearance. And the reason why it says v'taher now is because he doesn't have to wait, because he never gets the v'taher. So again, what does it possibly mean when it says v'taher? It can't mean that his tahara, whatever tumah halachas he had comes off, because that doesn't happen until the sun goes down. It must mean that there's some tumah halachas which will never come on, that he never had, and that must be priya prima, and therefore it shows that a musgar would never have the halachas of priya and prima, never had the halachas of the disheveled appearance. And whereas it's very nice pshat, the problem is that the word v'taher appears by zav, and there it cannot mean that it becomes tahar, that he was tahar all along and will never get this tumah, because there is no tumah that he's never going to get. A zav is a zav. So when it says that the zav, it says v'chibes begada v'taher. You ask the same thing, but he doesn't become tahar until the sun goes down. Now, therefore, obviously, you're wrong. When it says v'taher, it doesn't mean that there's some tahara that he's never going to get. It must mean that there's some tahara which applies right away, even before this sun goes down, and that is true. A zav does have some tahara right away when he comes out of the mikveh, even before this sun goes down. That is the halacha that if you move an earthenware kli, even without touching the kli, he's matameh. That stops when he comes out of the mikveh. A mitzara has also a halacha that stops when it comes out of the mikvah even before the sun goes down, and that's the halacha that he's matame anything that's in the room with him, even if he's not touching that. That halacha comes off. All right, so now we understand the word v'tar, but we do not have a source that priya prima does not apply to a mitzara muskar. So the Gemara gives another explanation. It's from Rava. Rava says the pasuk describing the priya prima says that it applies to someone that's hatzarua asher boy hanaga, the person who has taras on him. So it has to be that the taras is dependent on the appearance on his body, and it's going to stay taras until his body changes, until it heals. That's only a mukhlat. A musgar will leave his taras if it doesn't expand. As long as time's up and it hasn't spread, he will get out of his taras. Therefore, it's not dependent on his body, not dependent on it healing. It's dependent on the time passing. Therefore, you cannot apply what's in this pasuk to a muskar. It's only referring to somebody who has taras, and that will stay taras until he heals, and that's only a mukhlat. So Gemara says, if that's true, then the same halacha should apply to a shiluach, to the halacha of being sent out of the camp, because over there it also says, call yemei asher hanega boy yitma. So the halacha of being sent out of the camp is also said about somebody that the taras is dependent on his body, and therefore it should also only apply to a mukhlat and not a musgar. But our Mishnah clearly said that is not a difference between the two, that both of them require being sent out of the camp. So obviously you're wrong, and the fact that it's dependent on the body cannot be a difference between a musgar and a mukhlat. So Gemara says no. Really, you're right. We could have had that drasha even about halach of shiluach being sent out of the camp. The difference is that we have an extra special limud to tell me that even a musgar has to be sent out of the camp. But that's the fact that it says kol yemei, extra kol. It doesn't have to say kol yemei. It could have just said yemei. The days that he has taras, he has to be sent out of the camp. The fact says kol is to include even a musgar. So Gemara says, well, if you have an extra limud of kol, then that should apply to all halachas. It should apply even to the tahara procedure of shaving all the hair and bringing the karbanos of the birds. Why does it not apply to that? So the Gemara says the reason it doesn't apply to that is because there is a separate pasuk there to teach me that those do not apply. Because it says the only time you have to follow that procedure is if there is a healing of the taras. This muskar never had a healing. He never had taras. So there was no healing that took place. It doesn't have to get smaller. Even if it just stays the way it is, he becomes a tahar, and therefore the halachas of shaving and the birds, that entire procedure does not apply to him. All right, now we get to our final Mishnah, which discusses the difference between sfarim, that is sfarim of Torah, Nevi'im, and Ksuvim that are written on a cloth, the way that they are supposed to. How are those different than tefillin and mezuzahs, which are also written on parchment, at least the parshios inside the tefillin and the mezuzah, but those are not svarim. So the Mishnah says the difference is that svarim can be written in any language. Tefillin and mezuzah can only be written in Hebrew with the ksav ashuris, with the font of letters called ashuris. Now here, Shimon ben Gamliel points out that svarim could only be written in Greek. The only language that can be written besides Lashon Kodesh is Greek. Now, what's left out of this Mishnah is the halachas of sewing them with gidin. These svarim have to be sewn, the different pieces of parchment have to be sewn together with the sinews of a kosher animal. Also, they are metame, a person's hands, as we've seen in the daf yesterday. Sifrei Kodesh are metame hands, in order that they're not stored together with the truma, which would cause mice to eat them. So these two halachas apply to both equally, both to all kinds of svarim and to tefillin and mezuzahs.